He smiled suddenly, as if a holy vision had exploded in his head. "He eats pig," he said. He looked doubtful. "Or maybe pig smoke. He's in a period of transition." They all looked at me, thinking it over, then nodded. The king picked out 6 men. "Go get the thing some pigs," he said. The 6 men said, "Yes, sir," and got on their horses and rode off. It filled me with joy, though it was all crazy, and before I knew I could do it, I laughed. They jerked away and stood shaking, looking up. "The spirit's angry," one of them whispered. "It always has been," another one said. "That's why it's killing the tree." No, you're wrong," the hairless one said. "It's yelling for pig." "Pig!" I tried to yell. It scared them. They all began shouting at each other. One of the horses neighed and reared up, and for some crazy reason they took it for a sign. The king snatched an axe from the man beside him, and, without any warning, he hurled it at me. I twisted, letting out a howl, and it shot past my shoulder, just barely touching my skin. Blood trickled out. "You're all crazy!" I tried to yell, but it came out a moan. I bellowed for my mother. "Surround him!" the king yelled. "Save the horses!" And suddenly I knew I was dealing with no dull mechanical bull, but with thinking creatures, pattern makers, the most dangerous things I'd ever met. I shrieked at them, trying to scare them off, but they merely ducked behind bushes and took long sticks from the saddles of their horses, bows and javelins. "You're all crazy!" I bellowed. "You're all insane!" I'd never howled more loudly in my life. Darts like hot coals went through my legs and arms, and I howled more loudly still. And then, just when I was sure I was finished, a shriek 10 times as loud as mine came blaring off the cliff. It was my mother. She came roaring down like thunder, screaming like 1,000 hurricanes, eyes as bright as dragon fire, and before she was within a mile of us, the creatures had leaped to their horses and galloped away. Big trees shattered and fell from her path. The earth trembled. Then her smell poured in like blood into a silver cup, filling the moonlit clearing to the brim. And I felt the 2 trees that held me falling, and I was tumbling, free, into the grass. I woke up in the cave, warm firelight flickering on walls. My mother lay picking through the bone pile. When she heard me stir, she turned, wrinkling her forehead, and looked at me. There were no other shapes. I think I dimly understood even then that they'd gone deeper into darkness, away from men. I tried to tell her all that had happened, all that I'd come to understand. The meaningless objectness of the world, the universal bruteness. She only stared, troubled at my noise. She'd forgotten all language long ago, or maybe had never known any. I'd never heard her speak to the other shapes. How I myself learned to speak I can't remember. It was a long, long time ago. But I talked on, trying to smash through the walls of her unconsciousness. "The world resists me, and I resist the world," I said. "That's all there is. The mountains are what I define them as." Ah, monstrous stupidity of childhood, unreasonable hope. I waken with a start and see it over again. In my cave, out walking, or sitting by the mere, the memory rising as if it has been pursuing me. The fire in my mother's eyes brightens, and she reaches out as if some current is tearing us apart. "The world is all pointless accident," I say. shouting now, my fists clenched. I exist, nothing else. Her face works. She gets up on all fours, brushing dry bits of bone from her path, and with a look of terror, rising as if by unnatural power, she hurls herself across the void and buries me in her bristly fur and fat. I sicken with fear. My mother's fur is bristly, I say to myself. Her flesh is loose. Buried under my mother I cannot see. She smells of wild pig and fish. My mother smells of wild pig and fish, I say. What I see I inspire with usefulness, I think, trying to suck in breath. And all that I do not see is useless, void. I observe myself observing what I observe. It startles me. Then I am not that which observes. I am lack. Alack! No thread, no frailest hair between myself and the universal clutter. I listen to the underground river. I have never seen it. Talking, spinning a skin. A skin. I can't breathe, and I claw to get free. She struggles. I smell my mamma's blood, and, alarmed, I hear from the walls and floor of the cave the booming of her heart. Chapter 3. It wasn't because he threw that battle-axe that I turned on Hrothgar. That was mere midnight foolishness. I dismissed it, thought of it afterward only as you remember a tree that fell on you, or an adder you stepped on by accident, except, of course, that Hrothgar was more to be feared than a tree or snake. It wasn't until later, when I was full grown, and Hrothgar was an old man, that I settled my soul on destroying him, slowly and cruelly. Except for his thane's occasional stories of seeing my footprints, he'd probably forgotten by then that I existed. He'd been busy. I'd watched it all from the eaves of the forest, mostly from up off the ground in the branches. In the beginning there were various groups of them, ragged little bands that roamed the forest on foot or horseback. Crafty-witted killers that worked in teams, hunting through the summer, shivering in caves or little huts in the winter, occasionally wandering out into the snow to plough through it slowly, clumsily, after more meat. Ice clung to their eyebrows and beards and eyelashes, and I'd hear them whining and groaning as they walked. When two hunters from different bands came together in the woods, they would fight until the snow was slushy with blood, then crawl back, gasping and crying, to their separate camps, to tell wild tales of what happened. As the bands grew larger, they would seize and clear a hill, and with the trees they'd cut would set up shacks, and on the crown of the hill a large, shaggy house with a steeply pitched roof and a wide stone hearth, where they'd all go at night for protection from other bands of men. The inside walls would be beautifully painted and hung with tapestries, and every cross timber or falcon's perch was carved and gewgawed with toads, snakes, dragon shapes, deer, cows, pigs, trees, trolls. At the first sign of spring they would set out their shrines, and scatter seeds on the sides of the hill below the shacks, and would put up wooden fences to pen their pigs and cows. The women worked the ground and milked and fed the animals, while the men hunted. And when the men came in from the wolf roads at dusk, the women would cook the game they'd caught, while the men went inside and drank mead. Then they'd all eat, the men first, then the women and children, the men still drinking, getting louder and braver, talking about what they were going to do to the bands on the other hills. I would huddle, listening to their noise in the darkness, my eyebrows lifted, my lips pursed, the hair on the back of my neck standing up like pig's bristles. All the bands did the same thing. In time, I began to be more amused than revolted by what they threatened. It didn't matter to me what they did to each other. It was slightly ominous because of its strangeness. No wolf was so vicious to other wolves, but I half believed they weren't serious. They would listen to each other at the mead hall tables, their pinched, cunning rats' faces picking like needles at the boasters' words, the war-falcons gazing down, black, from the rafters. And when one of them finished his raving threats, another would stand up and lift up his ram's horn, or draw his sword, or sometimes both if he was very drunk, and he'd tell them what he'd planned to do. Now and then some trivial argument would break out, and one of them would kill another one, and all the others would detach themselves from the killer as neatly as blood-clotting, and they'd consider the case, and they'd either excuse him for some reason, or else send him out to the forest to live by stealing from their outlying pens like a wounded fox. At times I would try to befriend the exile. At other times I would try to ignore him, but they were treacherous. In the end, I had to eat them. As a rule, though, that wasn't how all their drinking turned out. Normally the men would howl out their daring, and the evening would get merrier, louder and louder, the king praising this one, criticizing that one, no one getting hurt except maybe some female who was asking for it, and eventually they'd all fall asleep on each other, like lizards, and I'd steal a cow. But the threats were serious. Darting unseen from camp to camp, I observed a change come over their drunken boasts. It was late spring. Food was plentiful. Every sheep and goat had its wobbly twins. The forest was teeming, and the first crops of the hillsides were coming into fruit. A man would roar, "I'll steal their gold and burn their mead hall," shaking his sword as if the tip were afire, and a man with eyes like two pins would say, "Do it now, cowface! I think you're not even the man your father was." The people would laugh. I would back away into the darkness, furious at my stupid need to spy on them. And I would glide to the next camp of men, and I'd hear the same. Then, once, around midnight, I came to a hall in ruins. The cows in their pens lay burbling blood through their nostrils, with javelin holes in their necks. None had been eaten. The watchdogs lay like dark, wet stones, with their heads cut off, teeth bared. The fallen hall was a square of flames and acrid smoke, and the people inside, none of them had been eaten either, were burned black, small, like dwarfs turned dark and crisp. The sky opened like a hole where the gables had loomed before, and the wooden benches, the trestle tables, the beds that had hung on the mead hall walls were scattered to the edge of the forest, shining charcoal. There was no sign of the gold they'd kept, not so much as a melted hilt. Then the wars began, and the war songs, and the weapon-making. If the songs were true, as I suppose at least one or two of them were, there had always been wars, and what I'd seen was merely a period of mutual exhaustion. I'd be watching a mead hall from high in a tree, night birds singing in the limbs below me, the moon's face hidden in a tower of clouds, and nothing would be stirring except leaves moving in the light spring breeze, and down by the pig pens 2 men walking with their battle-axes and their dogs. Inside the hall I would hear the shaper telling of the glorious deeds of dead kings, how they'd split certain heads, snuck away with certain precious swords and necklaces, his harp mimicking the rush of swords, clanging boldly with the noble speeches, sighing behind the hero's dying words. Whenever he stopped, thinking up formulas for what to say next, the people would all shout and thump each other and drink to the shaper's long life. In the shadow of the hall and by the outbuildings, men sat whistling or humming to themselves, repairing weapons, winding bronze bands around grey ash spears, treating their sword blades with snake's venom, watching the gold worker decorate the handles of battle-axes. The gold workers had an honored place. I remember one of them especially, a lean, aloof superior man of middle age. He never spoke to the others except to laugh sometimes. Nyeh, heh, heh. Then, suddenly, the birds below me in the tree would fall silent, and beyond the mead-hall clearing I'd hear the creak of harness leather. The watchmen and their dogs would stand stock still as if lightning struck. Then the dogs would bark, and the next instant the door would bang open, and men would come tumbling, looking crazy, from the mead-hall. The enemy's horses would thunder up into the clearing, leaping the pig fences, sending the cows and the pigs away mooing and squealing, and the two bands of men would charge. 20 feet apart they would slide to a stop and stand screaming at each other with raised swords. The leaders on both sides held their javelins high in both hands and shook them, howling their lungs out. Terrible threats from the few words I could catch. Things about their fathers and their fathers' fathers. Things about justice and honor and lawful revenge, their throats swollen, their eyes rolling like a newborn colt's, sweat running down their shoulders. Then they would fight, spears flying, swords wonking, arrows raining from the windows and doors of the mead-hall and the edge of the woods. Horses reared and fell over screaming. Ravens flew crazy as bats in a fire. Men staggered, gesturing wildly, making speeches, dying or sometimes pretending to be dying, sneaking off. Sometimes the attackers would be driven back. Sometimes they'd win and burn the mead-hall down. Sometimes they'd capture the king of the mead-hall and make his people give weapons and gold rings and cows. It was confusing and frightening, not in a way I could untangle. I was safe in my tree, and the men who fought were nothing to me, except, of course, that they talked in something akin to my language, which meant that we were incredibly related. I was sickened, if only at the waste of it. All they killed, cows, horses, men, they left to rot or burn. I sacked all I could and tried to store it, but my mother would growl and make faces because of the stink. The fighting went on all that summer, and began again the next, and again the next. Sometimes, when a mead-hall burned, the survivors would go to another mead-hall, and stretching out their hands would crawl unarmed up the strangers' hill and would beg to be taken in. They would give the strangers whatever weapons or pigs or cattle they'd saved from destruction, and the strangers would give them an outbuilding, the worst of their food, and some straw. The two groups would fight as allies after that, except that now and then they betrayed each other, one shooting the other from behind for some reason, or stealing the other group's gold some midnight, or sneaking into bed with the other group's wives and daughters. I watched it, season after season. Sometimes I watched from the high cliff wall, where I could look out and see all the mead-hall lights on the various hills across the countryside, glowing like candles, reflected stars. With luck, I might see, on a soft summer night, as many as 3 halls burning down at once. That was rare, of course. It grew rarer as the pattern of their warring changed. Hrothgar, who'd begun hardly stronger than the others, began to outstrip the rest. He'd worked out a theory about what fighting was for, and now he no longer fought with his 6 closest neighbors. He'd shown them the strength of his organization. And now, instead of making war on them, he sent men to them every 3 months or so, with heavy wagons and backslings, to gather their tribute to his greatness. They piled his wagons high with gold and leather and weapons, and they kneeled to his messengers and made long speeches, and promised to defend him against any foolhardy outlaw that dared to attack him. Hrothgar's messengers answered with friendly words and praise of the man they'd just plundered, as if the whole thing had been his idea, then whipped up the oxen, pulled up their loaded backslings, and started home. It was a hard trip. The tall, silky grass of the meadows and the paths along the forest would clog the heavy wagon spokes and snarl the oxen's hooves. Wagon wheels sunk in the rich black earth that only the wind had ever yet seeded or harvested. The oxen rolled their eyes, floundering, and mooed. Men swore. They pushed at the wheels with long oak poles, and slashed at the oxen till their backs were cross-hatched with bleeding welts, and their noses ran pink foam. Sometimes, with one terrific heave, an ox would break free of the traces and plunge into the brush. A man on a horse would go after it, slashed by branches, cutting through tangles of hazel and hawthorn, his horse balking at the pain of thorns, and sometimes, when the man found the ox, he would fill it with arrows and leave it to the wolves. Sometimes he merely sat when he found the ox, and met its stupid, gloomy eyes, and wept. Sometimes a horse, mired to the waist, would give up and merely stand, head hanging as if waiting for death. And the men would howl at it and cut it with whips, or throw stones or club it with heavy limbs, until finally one of them came to his senses and calmed the others, and they would winch out the horse with ropes and wagon wheels if they could, or else abandon the horse or kill it, first stripping off the saddle and bridle and the handsomely decorated harness. At times, when a wagon was hopelessly mired, the men would walk back to Hrothgar's hall for help. When they returned, the wagon would be emptied of all its gold and burned, sometimes by people of Hrothgar's own tribe, though usually by others, and the oxen and horses would be dead. Hrothgar met with his council for many nights and days, and they drank and talked and prayed to their curious carved-out creatures, and finally came to a decision. They built roads. The kings from whom they'd taken tributes of treasure they now asked for tributes of men. Then Hrothgar and his neighbors, loaded like ants on a long march, pushed foot by foot and day by day around the marshes and over the moors and through the woods, pressing flat rocks into the soft ground and grass, and packing smaller stones around the rocks' sides, until, from my watch on the wall of the cliff, Hrothgar's whole realm was like a wobbly, lopsided wheel with spokes of stone. And now, when enemies from farther out struck at kings who called themselves Hrothgar's friends, a messenger would slip out and ride through the night to the tribute-taker, and in half an hour, while the enemy bands were still shouting at each other, still waving their ash spears and saying what horrible things they would do, the forest would rumble with the sound of Hrothgar's horsemen. He would overcome them. His band had grown large, and for the treasures Hrothgar could afford now to give them in sign of his thanks, his warriors became hornets. New roads snaked out. New mead halls gave tribute. His treasure hoard grew till his mead hall was piled to the rafters with brightly painted shields and ornamented swords and boar's head helmets and coils of gold, and they had to abandon the mead hall and sleep in the outbuildings. Meanwhile, those who paid tribute to him were forced to strike at more distant halls to gather the gold they paid to Hrothgar, and a little on the side for themselves. His power overran the world, from the foot of my cliff to the northern sea to the impenetrable forests south and east. They hacked down trees in widening rings around their central halls, and blistered the land with peasant huts and pig-pen fences till the forest looked like an old dog dying of mange. They thinned out the game, killed birds for sport, set accidental fires that would burn for days. Their sheep killed hedges, snipped valleys bare, and their pigs nosed up the very roots of what might have grown. Hrothgar's tribe made boats to drive farther north and west. There was nothing to stop the advance of man. Huge boars fled at the click of a harness. Wolves would cower in the glens like foxes when they caught that deadly scent. I was filled with a wordless, obscurely murderous unrest. One night, inevitably, a blind man turned up at Hrothgar's temporary mead hall. He was carrying a harp. I watched from the shadow of a cowshed, since on that hill there were no trees. The guards at the door crossed their axes in front of him. He waited, smiling foolishly, while a messenger went inside. A few minutes later the messenger returned, gave the old man a grunt, and, cautiously, feeling ahead of himself with his crooked bare toes like a man engaged in some strange pious dance, the foolish smile still fixed on his face, the blind old man went in. A boy darted up from the weeds at the foot of the hill, the harper's companion. He too was shown in. The hall became quiet, and after a moment Hrothgar spoke, tones low and measured, of necessity from too much shouting on midnight raids. The harper gave him back some answer, and Hrothgar spoke again. I glanced at the watchdogs. They still sat silent as tree stumps, locked in my spell. I crept closer to the hall to hear. The people were noisy for a time, yelling to the harper, offering him mead, making jokes, and then again King Hrothgar spoke, white-bearded. The hall became still. The silence expanded. People coughed. As if all by itself. Then the harp made a curious run of sounds, almost words. And then a moment later, arresting as a voice from a hollow tree, the harper began to chant. Lo, we have heard the honour of the Spear-Danes, nation kings in days now gone. How those battle-lords brought themselves glory. Oft shield-chefing shattered the forces of kinsmen marauders, dragged away their mead-hall benches, terrified earls, after first men found him cast away. He got recompense for that. He grew up under the clouds, won glory of men till all his enemies, sitting around him, heard across the whale roads his demands, and gave him tribute. That was a good king. So he sang, or intoned, with the harp behind him, twisting together like sailors' ropes the bits and pieces of the best old songs. The people were hushed. Even the surrounding hills were hushed, as if brought low by language. He knew his art. He was king of the shapers, harp-string scratchers, oak-moss bearded, inspired by winds. That was what had brought him over wilderness, down blind man's alleys of time and space, to Hrothgar's famous hall. He would sing the glory of Hrothgar's line, and gild his wisdom, and stir up his men to more daring deeds. For a price. He told how Scyld, by the cunning of arms, had rebuilt the old Danish kingdom from ashes, lordless a long time before he came, and the prey of every passing band, and how Scyld's son, by the strength of his wits, had increased their power. a man who fully understood men's need from lust to love, and knew how to use it to fashion a mile-wide fist of chain-locked steel. He sang of battles and marriages, of funerals and hangings, the whimperings of beaten enemies, of splendid hunts and harvests. He sang of Hrothgar, hoar-frost white, magnificent of mind. When he finished, the hall was as quiet as a mound. I, too, was silent, my ear pressed tight against the timbers. Even to me, incredibly, he had made it all seem true and very fine. Now a little, now more, a great roar began, an exhalation of breath that swelled to a rumble of voices, and then to the howling and clapping and stomping of men gone mad on art. They would seize the oceans, the farthest stars, the deepest secret rivers in Hrothgar's name. Men wept like children. Children sat stunned. It went on and on, a fire more dread than any visible fire. Only one man in the kingdom seemed cast down. The man who'd been Hrothgar's harper before the blind man came to make his bid. The former harper crept out into the darkness, unnoticed by the rest. He slipped away through fields and forests, his precious old instrument under his arm, to seek out refuge in the hall of some lesser marauder. I, too, crept away, my mind aswim in ringing phrases, magnificent, golden, and all of them, incredibly, lies. What was he? The man had changed the world, had torn up the past by its thick, gnarled roots, and had transmuted it. And they, who knew the truth, remembered it his way. And so did I. I crossed the moors in a queer panic, like a creature half insane. I knew the truth. It was late spring. Every sheep and goat had its wobbly twins. A man said, "I'll steal their gold and burn their mead hall," and another man said, "Do it now." I remembered the ragged men fighting each other till the snow was red slush, whining in winter, the shriek of people and animals burning, the whip-slashed oxen in the mire, the scattered battle-leavings, wolf-torn corpses, falcons fat with blood. Yet I also remembered, as if it had happened, great Shield, of whose kingdom no trace remained, and his far-sighted son, of whose greater kingdom no trace remained. And the stars overhead were alive with the promise of Hrothgar's vast power, his universal peace. The moors their axes had stripped of trees glowed silver in the moonlight, and the yellow lights of peasant huts were like scattered jewels on the raven-dark cloak of a king. I was so filled with sorrow and tenderness, I could hardly have found it in my heart to snatch a pig. Thus I fled, ridiculous, hairy creature torn apart by poetry, crawling, whimpering, streaming tears across the world like a two-headed beast, like mixed-up lamb and kid at the tail of a baffled, indifferent ewe. And I gnashed my teeth and clutched the sides of my head as if to heal the split. But I couldn't. There was a Shield once who ruled the Danes, and other men ruled after him. That much was true. And the rest... At the top of the cliff wall I turned and looked down, and I saw all the lights of Hrothgar's realm, and the realms beyond that would soon be his. and to clear my mind I sucked in wind and screamed. The sound went out, violent to the rims of the world, and after a moment it bounced back up at me, harsh and ungodly against the sigh of the remembered harp, like 1,000 tortured rat squeals crying, "Lost!" I clamped my palms to my ears, and stretched up my lips, and shrieked again, a stab at truth, a snatch at apocalyptic glee. Then I ran on all fours, chest pounding, to the smoky mere. Chapter 4. He sings to a heavier harp song now, old heart-string scratcher, memory scraper, of the richest of kings made sick of soul by the scattered bones of thanes. By late afternoon the fire dies down, and the column of smoke is white, no longer greasy. There will be others this year, they know, yet they hang on. The sun backs away from the world like a crab, and the days grow shorter, the nights grow longer, more dark and dangerous. I smile, angry in the thickening dusk, and feast my eyes on the greatest of mead halls, unsatisfied. His pride, the torch of kingdoms, heart. The shaper remains, though now there are nobler courts where he might sing, the pride of creation. He built this hall by the power of his songs, created with casual words its grave morality, mortality. The boy observes him, tall and solemn, 12 years older than the night he first crept in with his stone-eyed master. He knows no art but tragedy, a moving singer. The credit is wholly mine. Inspired by winds, or whatever you please, the old man sang of a glorious mead hall whose light would shine to the ends of the ragged world. The thought took seed in Hrothgar's mind. It grew. He called all his people together and told them his daring scheme. He would build a magnificent mead hall high on a hill with a view of the western sea, a victory seat near the giant's work, old ruined fortress from the world's first war, to stand forever as a sign of the glory and justice of Hrothgar's Danes. There he would sit and give treasures out, all wealth, but the lives of men and the people's land. And so his sons would do after him, and his sons' sons to the final generation. I listened, huddled in the darkness, tormented, mistrustful. I knew them, had watched them, yet the things he said seemed true. He sent to far kingdoms for woodsmen, carpenters, metalsmiths, goldsmiths, also carters, victuallers, clothiers to attend to the workmen, and for weeks their uproar filled the days and nights. I watched from the vines and boulders of the giant's ruin 2 miles off. Then word went out to the races of men that Hrothgar's hall was finished. He gave it its name. From neighboring realms and from across the sea came men to the great celebration. The harper sang. I listened, felt myself swept up. I knew very well that all he said was ridiculous. Not light for their darkness, but flattery, illusion, a vortex pulling them from sunlight to heat, a kind of midsummer burgeoning waltz to the sickle. Yet I was swept up. "Ridiculous!" I hissed in the black of the forest. I snatched up a snake from beside my foot and whispered to it, "I knew him when." But I couldn't bring out a wicked cackle as I'd meant to do. My heart was light with Hrothgar's goodness, and leaden with grief at my own bloodthirsty ways. I backed away, crab-like, further into darkness, like a crab retreating in pain when you strike 2 stones at the mouth of his underwater den. I backed away till the honey-sweet lure of the harp no longer mocked me. Yet even now my mind was tormented by images. Thanes filled the hall, and a great silent crowd of them spilled out over the surrounding hill, smiling, peaceable, hearing the harper, as if not a man in all that lot had ever twisted a knife in his neighbour's chest. "Well, then, he's changed them," I said, and stumbled and fell on the root of a tree. "Why not?" "Why not?" the forest whispered back. Yet not the forest, something deeper, an impression from another mind, some live thing, old and terrible. I listened, tensed. Not a sound. "He reshapes the world," I whispered, belligerent. "So his name implies. He stares strange-eyed at the mindless world and turns dry sticks to gold." A little poetic, I would readily admit. His manner of speaking was infecting me, making me pompous. "Nevertheless," I whispered crossly, but I couldn't go on, too conscious all at once of my whispering, my eternal posturing, always transforming the world with words, changing nothing. I still had the snake in my fist. I set it down. It fled. "He takes what he finds," I said stubbornly, trying again. "And by changing men's minds, he makes the best of it. Why not?" But it sounded petulant, and it wasn't true, I knew. He sang for pay, for the praise of women, one in particular, and for the honor of a famous king's hand on his arm. If the ideas of art were beautiful, that was art's fault, not the shaper's. A blind selector, almost mindless, a bird. Did they murder each other more gently because in the woods sweet songbirds sang? Yet I wasn't satisfied. His fingers picked infallibly, as if moved by something beyond his power, and the words stitched together out of ancient songs, the scenes interwoven out of dreary tales, made a vision without seams, an image of himself, yet not himself, beyond the need of any shaggy old gold friend's pay, the projected possible. "Why not?" I whispered, jerking forward, struggling to make my ears sear through the dark trunks and vines. I could feel it all around me, that invisible presence, chilly as the first intimation of death, the dusty, unblinking eyes of 1,000 snakes. There was no sound. I touched a fat, slick loop of vine, prepared to leap back in horror, but it was only vine.